Welcome to the 4th Annual Latin America Energy Conference. I'm Lisa Vicidi, Director of the Energy, Climate Change, and Extractive Industries Program at the Inter-American Dialogue. Firstly, I would like to thank our sponsors today, Chevron and ConocoPhillips, as well as the program's Energy and Resources Committee members for making this event possible. 2020 has been a tumultuous year for Latin America's energy sector, and there's still a great deal of uncertainty about the direction of many policy issues. COVID-19 has upended markets, resulting in depressed oil demand and lower prices, affecting fiscal revenues for exporters throughout the region. State-owned oil companies specifically face a lot of challenges. In Mexico, for example, Pemex still struggles with rising debt and falling oil production, and the government is discussing measures to strengthen the firm as it requires more and more state support. In Argentina, COVID-19 and debt talks have absorbed the first year of Alberto Fernandez's presidency. But developing Vaca Muerta is still a priority, and YPF's strategy for increasing shale output is crystallizing. Brazil's Petrobras, I think, has fared somewhat better, benefiting from increased Asian demand. And though it's not escaped the pandemic unscathed, its divestment campaign continues. Our first panel of experts today will analyze the current landscape for national oil companies in Latin America. Also, the outcome of the looming presidential election in the United States will have broad implications for U.S. energy diplomacy toward Latin America. How will the U.S. engage on energy policy with Mexico, given the current administration's hostility toward private investment from U.S. and other companies? Will U.S. oil sanctions against Venezuela be escalated or rolled back, depending on who's the next U.S. president? What does the outcome of the election mean for the U.S. position on climate change and oil and gas exports? Former Trump and Obama-Biden administration officials will address these questions later today. Despite the uncertainties, I would say that there are also some clear opportunities. Advancements in technologies like battery storage are facilitating the integration of intermittent renewable energy sources and improving grid resilience. And our energy storage panel will help us understand the real potential for energy storage technologies, and it'll focus on issues like how battery storage is supporting mini grids in rural areas, how electric vehicles could be used for stationary storage to send energy back to the grid, and whether Latin American countries can develop lithium resources at scale for local battery storage projects. In Colombia, the government has proposed a reform to the royalties distribution system that would give more resources to producing regions. It's also seeking to advance pilot projects for unconventional oil and gas projects. And many new regulations have been introduced to advance clean energy. So later this morning, Colombian Energy Minister Diego Mesa will discuss these developments. The Trump administration has sought to strengthen U.S. partnerships in energy with Latin America and the Caribbean under the U.S. government initiative America Crece, as underscored by the recent trip to Suriname, Guyana, Colombia, and Brazil by Secretary of State Pompeo and Assistant Secretary Francis Fannin, who will join us in a keynote session this afternoon. In this context, we've organized today's conference with the aim of fostering a dialogue about Latin America's oil and gas and power and renewable sectors, as well as the relationship with the United States. So with that introduction, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Nate Graham, who's the Energy, Climate Change, and Extractive Industries Program Associate, and he will moderate the first panel. Thank you all for joining us, and I really look forward to the rest of the sessions today.
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you to everybody for joining us. I'd like to get started on this first panel on the region's national oil companies by putting our discussion into some context. So as COVID-19 and the effects of measures to contain it rippled around the globe, April yielded the lowest oil prices in decades, as many of you all know. And crude prices have lingered around $40 per barrel since early June, as the global economy has experienced an uneven recovery. In the case of Latin America's national oil companies, this affects not only the bottom line, but the fiscal health of many of the region's economies. However, COVID-19 is obviously not the only factor shaping the fates of the region's NOCs this year. In Mexico, Pemex's woes continued. In July, its production hit its lowest level in 40 years, and production forecasts keep falling as its debt and financing costs continue to rise. Fitch and Moody's now both rate the company's bonds as junk. And meanwhile, discussions about explicitly bolstering the state firm's role in the energy sector through a reversal of the 2013 liberalizing energy reform have recently gained traction as the company's poor performance makes it a greater burden on state coffers. In Colombia, on the other hand, Ecopetrol raised its 2020 investment plan in July after initially slashing it by almost half earlier in the pandemic. We won't discuss Venezuela on this panel. It will be covered in some of the discussions later today, but clearly the situation there has deteriorated as PDVSA's production has continued to fall and is now below 400,000 barrels per day. In Ecuador, production was disrupted in April by mudslides that took out the country's main pipelines, but it has since then returned to a steady, albeit stagnant output. Changes are happening there downstream with market-based fuel pricing being introduced, Petroecuador's fuel monopoly coming to an end, and a private partner being sought for the Esmeraldas refinery. In Bolivia, the future of the natural gas sector and the role of YPFB versus private companies is likely to hinge on the presidential election, for which the first round will be held in less than 2 weeks now. So we'll talk about what the possible outcomes will mean there. In Brazil, low oil prices have outweighed Petrobras's record exports to China amid the pandemic, hurting the company's bottom line and leading to capex reductions. But it is forging ahead with its focus on the Presalt and its aggressive divestment of refineries and other assets. And last week, there was a major Supreme Court decision ruling that the firm could sell its refineries without congressional approval, and liberalization of the natural gas market was passed by the lower house of Congress in early September. And finally, in Argentina, after a pause of nearly 6 months, despite a government-set support price for oil, YPF has resumed drilling in Vaca Muerta, where the million-dollar question remains how the government of Alberto Fernandez will stimulate investment in the shale formation and increase pipeline capacity to ensure gas can be transported, both to supply the domestic market and for export. The administration has signaled a shift away from LNG exports toward prioritizing pipeline exports to the country's neighbors, and the development of a hydrocarbon investment law announced in March, shortly before being put on pause by COVID-19, is back in motion. So we've got a lot of ground to cover, and here to discuss all of this are 3 distinguished panelists. So first we have Jeremy Martin, who's joining us very early in the morning from California, for which we're very grateful. He is Vice President of Energy and Sustainability at the Institute of the Americas. We also have Alejandra León. She is Director for Latin America Upstream at IHS Markit. And finally, Sylvie, who is founder and managing partner of Prysma ENT Consultores Associados in Brazil. I just want to quickly issue a reminder to submit questions in the Q&A, where you can also upvote questions submitted by other attendees. You can also submit questions by emailing meetings@thedialogue.org. So let's get started with Jeremy's remarks. Jeremy, you have the floor.
Hey, thank you, Nate. Indeed, still a little bit early in the morning out here in California, but always a pleasure to join the Dialogue's annual energy conference, Latin American Energy Conference. So appreciate the opportunity. Thanks as well to Lisa Vasidi and everyone at Dialogue. Sarah, thank you for your help in the back end of the Zoom here. It's always, like I said, a pleasure to be part of this important conversation discussion. I guess I should also be sure to underscore what Lisa mentioned, the thanks to Chevron and ConocoPhillips for sponsoring and allowing the space for discussion about Latin America's energy sector. And of course, I'm so happy to share the panel with, and I've been voted, speaking of voting up, I've been voted up in the order here to go first. So thank you for that, Alejandra and Sylvie, two amazing thought leaders from across our region, and pleased to call both of them friends and look forward to sharing this conversation with them. So I'm just going to go through a few ideas. I think what Nate, you all asked me to do is set the scene a little bit in general terms before we get into some specific countries. And I think it might be useful and worthwhile. I mean, although it might be stating the obvious, it's probably a good way to set up our conversation. if we go back a bit in time, and I always like to tell a story when I try and make some remarks. And so my story begins in 2008, or the story for the opening of this panel begins in 2008, when Latin America quickly emerged from the recession and the economic downturn in the globe in 2008. And indeed, the regions experienced 6-7 years of amazingly high growth rates. However, by around 2014, 2015, when commodity prices began to soften, what many refer to as the end of the commodity super cycle, we started to see a precipitation and deterioration in many economies in the region. So the downturn in commodity prices at the end of that super cycle started to ripple across the region, I would say, beginning as long as 4 or 5 years ago. And so, in fact, that amazing recovery from the previous global downturn in 08 was largely reversed, if not totally erased, in some of the markets. The reason I start this story there is because this is all important to bear in mind as we look at what Latin America looked like when it entered the COVID pandemic in crisis. And the point there is that the countries of the region, generally speaking, were in fragile and weak economic position, and therefore, by extension, the region's national oil companies were likewise in fragile and some very poor economic conditions. And I think you've alluded to that in your opening to certain examples of some in worse conditions than others. There's obviously distinctions, and that's the point of the panel, to get into that, and the distinctions are critical and across some of the national oil companies of the region. But I think general terms are important to understand, and the general economic conditions, the macroeconomic conditions in the major oil and gas countries of the region greatly impact the NOCs and continue to impact the NOCs. And so indeed, this dual crisis you referenced as well, and everyone is so familiar with, but it's hugely important to understand that this dual crisis for oil markets, I would suggest, is far from over. And this is increasingly and continues to be particularly relevant for oil-dependent economies, whether we're talking about at the national level, such as Colombia and Ecuador. But also, I think when you look at Argentina, for example, you're having internal discussions that are also at the subnational level. And indeed, the barril criollo, this price signal that was devised in the country, was less a national effort than it was upward pressure from below at the subnational level in the provinces, the oil-producing provinces, to try and navigate a way through the crisis. And that was because of the economic windfall that had evaporated from oil production in those provinces. So, point being that this dual crisis is hugely impactful in certain markets, not just at the national, but also subnational level, and as the case in Argentina demonstrates. And so I think, we can't say this enough, but the demand destruction has been massive, and the level of recovery so far has been extremely uneven. You alluded to some positive signals in some places, but overall, demand destruction is huge, and recovery so far very uneven. The recovery for the price of oil has slowed, and I think we're all hearing and understand a lower for longer scenario. And of course, Latin America is by no means escaping this global trend. As a matter of fact, in some ways, living it very perilously in terms of the lower for longer scenario. And that is, again, like something you mentioned, Nate, impacting fiscal accounts. It's having a dramatic impact. This lower price, lower demand for fiscal accounts and treasuries across Latin American countries. So the point is, when we combine these global elements together with the regional elements, we really have what can be considered a boiling cauldron of concerns for the region's national oil companies. And if I turn to some analysis done by Fitch Ratings, we understand just how important that price point is. Fitch did an analysis of what you could say are the principal national oil companies of the region: Pemex, Petrobras, Ecopetrol, and YPF. And according to the Fitch data, they all have cost structures in place. Their cost per barrel of oil equivalent either right around that $40 or slightly above it in terms of their cost to produce a barrel of oil equivalent. So the national oil companies of the region are not in a position to navigate low prices for a long time. As a matter of fact, the $40 price and below is an absolute killer, as we've seen so far this year. And so I think the fact is that those break-even, those higher break-evens, as we all know, oftentimes include not just taxes and royalties that are hugely important for their overall economic, macroeconomic support of the nation, but also social and social derived programs. And I think you mentioned the royalty reform effort in Colombia, and that is absolutely critical to navigating just exactly that element of social impacts. And I would suggest that these break-even prices in the lower for longer scenario could increasingly have critical social impacts in many countries of the region that have so often and can continue to depend on the revenue from oil to indeed support their social programming and other critical elements for society. So I think just when we talk about the macroeconomic context, just to give a couple examples, and I think there's probably no more dramatic example at this point than YPF in Argentina. And in September, you know, I think Lisa mentioned in her opening that the first year of the Fernandez government has effectively been spent on renegotiating the debt and new fiscal regime measures. And indeed, in September, when the national government put in place a host of new currency controls and fiscal measures, it was YPF that was one of the most impacted players, given both its international debt and the critical need for the company to access dollars. And so the situation in Argentina, which is drastic and doesn't show any signs of lessening in the near future, I think is the microcosm of just why and how the macroeconomic context is so critical for the region's NOCs. YPF is absolutely paying the price for some of the national fiscal measures and the lack of macroeconomic stability in that country. But let me start to wrap up on perhaps a more positive note and suggest that I think when you start to look at a lot of these factors, they actually will probably begin to drive pragmatism, right? And I think the need to attract capital and the need to reset as part of the recovery and have energy be a principal factor of the recovery and to ameliorate some of those impacts I mentioned earlier of the oil-dependent economies, we'll continue to see definitely in 2021, but even in the latter part of this year, the last quarter, some pragmatism on the parts of governments and by extension the national oil companies. And I would suggest that's particularly the case in markets such as Ecuador, Brazil, and Colombia, where we've already seen announcements and recent activity pointing towards liberalization and the desire to compete globally for constrained capital, international capital, private, as well as perhaps development bank and multilateral financing. So I think NOCs in these countries, on the back of pragmatism and on the back of the need to continue to take a more international competitive posture, will seek divestitures of non-core and costly assets with an eye towards efficiencies and reducing that cost per barrel, as well as infusions of needed capital, which could also extend by nature of their tax and royalties to the national government and national coffers. And I think we've already seen that just in recent days with the announcements by Ecopetrol, where they'll be hosting an auction in the fourth quarter of 9 assets in Colombia, 9 onshore fields that Ecopetrol has determined that they'll put up for auction. You mentioned, Nate, their sort of revised investment scenarios. So you couple some of these things together, and I think you see in Colombia with Ecopetrol a pretty important posture of pragmatism on how to navigate through the crisis and come out the other side, the end of this year, definitely early 2021. And also you referenced Petrobras's ongoing divestiture efforts. I think that's hugely important to note when we distinguish the countries and the NOCs and what their performance and outlook are going into the end of the year and early next year. The legislative process in Brazil for liberalizing the natural gas market that I know Sylvie will talk about is a key factor for Petrobras. I would suggest it removes much of the de facto burden of Petrobras as the de facto monopoly in the gas market, and so that again will aid and ameliorate some of the strain on the national oil company of Brazil. And lastly, I think it's important to note with Ecuador, for the better part of the Moreno government, there has been an effort to merge and bring together the 2 national oil companies, one that was focused on the upstream and one that was focused on the downstream, PetroEcuador and Petroamazonas, and that'll go into effect next January. And that merger will indeed, again, be pragmatic in the sense of the eye to reducing cost, efficiencies, and also in terms of where budget gets expended by the national oil company and the new merged national oil company. And to your point, we already see a direct indication of that with the tendering of the Esmeraldas refinery in Ecuador for private development. So just to wrap up, and in summary, I think that if we're being honest with ourselves, the outlook overall for the region's national oil companies is not great, but there are certainly individual cases that offer more hope than others. And there is reason for expectation of progress and pragmatism, as I said, as the year wraps up and the new year begins. And so is often the case, we need to be careful of wide generalizations when we talk about NOCs of Latin America, and when we dial in and look at specific cases, we know that there's certainly not a one-size-fits-all narrative, and each market is considerably unique. Some with some navigating the crisis better than others, some perhaps still trying to understand what their path forward is. And I'll leave Bolivia a little bit for the conversation, because I think that deserves a bit of its own discussion, given, like you said, the last year and the political uncertainty and the campaign underway. So that's sort of my opening and thoughts on where we are regionally with NOCs. And I didn't speak much about Mexico and Pemex either, because I know that we've got Alejandra with us, who will provide absolutely everything we need to know about Pemex, which unfortunately may not be good news, but I'm sure Alejandra will do a wonderful job explaining it to us. So there you go, Nate. Hopefully that's useful to set the scene and tell a story to begin our conversation.
Yes, Jeremy, thank you. That's excellent analysis, as always. Yeah, let's go over to Alejandra, who I think has got some slides, so she might need a second to share her screen.
So thank you, Jeremy, for those nice words. Very good introduction. Thank you, Nate. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for the invitation to share with you this morning a little talks about the NOCs, specifically for Pemex. I'm going to be brief, I promise. So as Jeremy said, most of these companies and all the industry in general, I think, was just coming into a kind of recovery after the 2014-2016 slowdown in prices. And it took us as an industry a long time for really recover a little bit from that. The story at that time was how companies were able to increase efficiency was very dramatically. So we are just coming on from that situation, and suddenly we are again with this pandemic. Nobody could really anticipate this situation. The industry is hit again, and it's very hard to recover, and the situation is complicated. I think this time we cannot see the huge gainings on efficiencies as we saw last time. There is a little room for that, even though there is still room for that. The other side of the story is that some of the companies was already recovering in terms of how they handling their debts or their cash flows, and they are able to survive a little bit better this time, thanks for this financial better situation in some companies. Unfortunately, it's not the case for Pemex. I think Pemex was really in a very bad financial situation for a long time, was not able to fix their financial situation during the 2014-2016 crisis. And it was also involved in a whole change with Mexico energy reform during those days. And it's just starting these changes and how the company do business, or how the company would be able to change their situation when, well, this pandemic is bringing low oil prices again, low oil demand, and it's not easy for Pemex. The other issue is that certainly Pemex is still 100% owned by the state, and that's make this NOC even more exposure for the political cycles and the political interests each time they change in Mexico. And we have this a new administration starting in 2018 with completely different ideas of what we have been seeing in the previous 6 years. So that certainly is impacting Pemex too. So that's why I bring into your memories that this administration is really consistent. A lot of people say that they don't know what they are doing. Well, they has been very consistent on what they are saying about energy matters. They have been saying since the campaign, the electoral campaign, and up to these days, even with the pandemic, they are still saying the same. They want to strengthen the NOCs, the Mexican NOCs, Pemex and CFE, and they want to aspire for energy self-sufficiency. The other thing is that they are saying they are not going to change the law for the first 3 years of the administration. So we are still with 1 year for not seeing those changes, but we will see. So they are very consistent, and they are the main statements about energy. With that in mind, let me back to Pemex, and of course the pandemic impact, how all companies really has been hit by this. The NOCs in the region, basically all of them announced cuts on investment, on capex. Pemex was one of the ones that really announced a relative moderate cut on expenditures. Basically, Pemex announced like a 10% cut on capex, while other companies reduced like 30% or even 60% in the case of YPF in Argentina, for example. For next year, Jeremy also said this is going to be a long time recovery, right? So certainly for next year, we are not really expecting a huge improvement on how they can spend money. For Pemex, these days in Mexico, the discussions for the budget for the next year has been started, and certainly they are not very promising about how much they can expect. The other hand, we can see the government of Mexico supporting Pemex, and part of the statement saying we need to strengthen the NOCs is certainly how we are going to support, and they have been very consistent with that. So since 2019, we saw some of these efforts from the government to transfer money to Pemex or giving some kind of support, financial support mainly. For this year, for example, we saw the reduction of the main tax over hydrocarbons production for Pemex, that is the DUC, the profit sharing duty that Pemex pay. It was reduced from 65% to 58% in 2020. Also in April, the government announced additional fiscal stimulus for the payment of this DUC for Pemex, up to the cap of about $3 billion. We still saw this transfer directly from the government to Pemex in order to build the refinery. So this year we are calculating at or is what Pemex has been saying is about almost $7 billion that the government is directly supporting into Pemex. But that is also a concern. I mean, we saw, let me come back here a little bit. We saw all this support, and certainly is also the concern, and we saw all the financial ratings agency downgrading the credit for Pemex and downgrading also the level of investment for Mexico. And the concern, I think, is not if Pemex has enough money and not if a government is able to continue giving this support to Pemex, but we don't see really if Pemex is spending that money in a way that could really guarantee the returns and guarantee the payment of those steps. So that is very critical. Even we saw this support is what they are really doing with that money. In order to be brief, I just want also to say that Pemex we used to think only in the oil and gas sector, but certainly one of the main concerns on Pemex is how the company has been carry on their shoulder a lot of other activities and a lot of other issues like the fuels market and refining. Refineries are really in a very bad conditions. They requires a lot of maintenance, a lot of repairs, and of course, ideally, they requires an upgrading and really be able to add more capacity for processing the residues or the bottom of the barrels in order to get not only much lighter crudes, lighter products, but also cleaner products. That could be really the ideal. With the reform, with the energy reform, certainly Pemex was relieved in certain way of the obligation for guarantee the supply for all the country in terms of gasoline and diesel. That was really hard for Pemex to meet, and certainly has been losing money on refining activities for long time also. And so the energy reform brings this kind of relief on Pemex, and certainly is a good appetite from private sector to get into this market, into refined products market. Really is a good opportunity for Mexico for building new infrastructure to get better products, competition, better prices also. So certainly the private sector has been in and has been taking part or share of this market, gaining little by little some of the share. During the pandemic, certainly we saw the private sector increase their imports of gasoline and diesel. We expect as demand is recovering, well, maybe Pemex is increasing imports again, but this dynamic is really good for the market, is improving, it's taking time, of course. With this new administration is slowing down a little bit. There is a lot of uncertainties, but it's still there. And just my last comment about Mexico and Pemex itself. This is a market on evolution. We saw this energy reform is just starting in the sense that we are still in this process for developing competitive markets in Mexico. And Pemex is a kind of on-hold situation in terms of how the company can take advantage of all the mechanisms that the reform brings into the market, like doing associations or farm outs or things like that. So it's certainly on hold. The law hasn't changed anything. This administration is respecting the commitment to don't change any law in the first 3 years. So certainly the law is still the same, the legal framework is still the same, but implementation is not happening. Implementation is really on hold. They are not launching any new E&P round. Pemex is not doing any new farm out or something different. And in that sense, 2021 elections in Mexico are very critical. Let me just put into the framework. In 2021, the mid of 2021, we are going to change 15 governors in the country. Basically, most of them are from opposition parties, not the Morena party. And we are going to change the full deputies chamber. Certainly today, Morena has a majority on the deputies, but 2021 is going to be very critical because it could change the balance completely. It could be really favoring Morena, or it could be really taking or lowering their dominance in our political framework. I just want to remember the Mexican population has been each time more and more polarized in terms of people that really don't want Morena to continue in the power, and people that really defend that. It can be really, really polarized, and in this situation is really, really unclear where the balance is going to end in 2021. And it's very critical because if Morena strengthening their political power, it could be easier for them to do deeper changes or profound changes in any legislation, including the Constitution. In Mexico, for changing the Constitution, you need not just the relative majority in the Congress, you need the two-thirds of the Congress, and also you need to go to the local Congresses, and you need to won in the majority of the local Congresses that are 17 Congress, right? So certainly these next elections, next year elections are very critical to see the new balance of power and to see how much this administration could move forward on changing the laws in Mexico in terms of energy. I think I'm going to leave here these comments about Mexico and Pemex. Let me see.
Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you very much. Let's go over to Sylvie, who's also got some slides.
Hello. I'm trying to get my slide to appear.
Perfect.
Do you see them?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning to everybody. I would like to first thank very much the Inter-American Dialogue and Lisa VCD to invite me. It's a pleasure to be here this morning and to share some thoughts, some ideas about Brazil with the other members of the panel. Thank you for such a good introduction, Nate and Jeremy. Luckily, we all agree, so you'll save me some time. I will focus my initial remarks on two topics. First, the new gas bill, which Nate have already mentioned, but more generally, the ongoing natural gas reform, of which the gas bill is one ingredient, and what is the status of all these and what are the implications both for Brazil and for Petrobras. And then the second topic will be the impact of COVID-19 on Petrobras performance and on the large divestment program that Petrobras is implementing. So when we're talking about market reform, it's not a new topic. It started in 2016 with discussions to improve natural gas legislation under the initiative that at the time was called Gas para Crecer, Gas to Grow. But it's important to remark that Petrobras at that time had already started divesting some natural assets. At the time, it had already negotiated the sale of 49% of Gaspetro, which owns distribution assets all over Brazil, and TAG, which is a transportation. It wasn't trying to sell TAG as a whole, and then ended up selling a part of it in 2016. But in 2017, the work of the Gas para Crecer committees resulted in a new gas bill, which was actually proposed by the government, but because of the turmoil, the political turmoil in those years, it was the time when President Dilma lost her the new gas bill was not approved. Instead, in 2018, a decree introduced some important changes, but it's important to know that a decree doesn't change a law, so several things still needed to be put in place. In 2019, the new government launched a new program. They renamed it. It's called New Gas Market, Novo Mercado de Gás in Portuguese. And initially, the program was set to actually pursue reform through secondary legislation and other types of agreements with Petrobras, incentive to state government, etc. An important piece of all this was the cease and desist agreement, which we call TCC in Brazilian, between CADE and Petrobras, and that's determined that Petrobras had to sell all remaining stakes in natural gas transportation and distribution networks. However, in 2020, the new gas bill is back on the agenda and was approved in the Chamber of Deputies in late August and is now being discussed in the Senate. Big question is, when will it be approved in Senate? It depends on really how long the discussion, how many amendments are made, and if amendments are made, it will have to go back to the Chamber of Deputies. It is still possible to have the gas bill approved this year, but it could also go into next year, depending on how much the discussion go on. But it's important to say that the new gas bill is a necessary but not sufficient part of the reform process. And there is still a lot of work that will be needed once, it's just, sorry for that. Once it's approved. The new gas bill is important because it will give greater legal security to investors. There is a need for lots of investments in Brazil. And it will also help to modify certain aspects of the regulatory framework that needs a law to be modified. So it will step up things in a way that secondary legislation only could not be done. But still, there will be a lot to be done by ANP. For example, ANP has a 4-year regulatory agenda. It has already been delayed by the pandemic. It's a transition program that will last some time. And in the meanwhile, the new law will give some visibility and a level playing ground for new players. What are the implications for Brazil and what are the implications for Petrobras? Well, the aim of this legal and regulatory reform is to increase gas players, especially in gas supply, to foster competition, in order for them to access the market, guarantee a non-discriminative access to infrastructure, transportation in particular, liberalize the final market. This is in order to allow large consumers to choose their supplier. When all this is in place, what we expect is more efficient use of infrastructure, eventually lower gas price for final consumer, and that would mean gas demand grow, market growth. For Petrobras, I tend to agree with Jeremy that the gas reform and the gas bill will remove a burden of being the only supplier to the gas market. So Petrobras, it's important to say Petrobras had already started restructuring and divesting its gas assets before the gas reform. So the divestment is not a result of the gas reform, but it accompanies it. It's actually needed in order to help Petrobras to divest its gas assets. A large part of Petrobras actually involves selling midstream and downstream assets. And that includes many assets have already been sold, but there are others, including gas-fired power plants, regas terminals, and fertilizers plant, for example, which remains to be either sold or leased out. And the reform and the new bill will facilitate the sale, and it will also increase their value. So for Petrobras, I would say this is very positive. Even for the sale of its upstream assets, the gas reform is important because it will help buyers, new players in the upstream to see an added value to associated gas. Today, monetizing gas in Brazil is very difficult, and therefore associated natural gas is seen more like a cost or a neutral aspect, but it doesn't add value to the E&P project. And the gas law and the gas reform in general should change that. Regarding the second part of my remarks, yes, Petrobras has been hit like other companies, other oil and gas company, by the COVID-19 and economic crisis. And EBITDA is gone down. The indebtedness too was decreasing and has been rising a little bit, but not as much as could be expected. What we've seen is that luckily the company had done a lot of work on its performance before, and therefore was stronger when the crisis hit, was more resilient. Regarding production, for example, just like other oil and gas company, production was affected. There was a sharp decline in oil products demand due to all the shutdown activities and stay-at-home measures, etc. But Petrobras was extremely successful in increasing its exports, mainly to China, which made the initial decrease less strong, and the rebound more quicker, as you can see in this chart here. We are nearly back to the pre-crisis level of production. Divestment have continued moving forward in 2020 a little more slowly, but that would be expected. But still, there has been a lot of closing or closed sales in 2000, in particular in the oil and gas sector. What we've seen is Petrobras has been able to sell its last equity in the two transportation companies, NTS and TAC. TBG is still being negotiated, as well as the equity interest in distribution companies. It is important to understand that the sale of the gas market asset, also of the refining asset, are quite a sensitive issue in Brazil. There has been a lot of opposition, but the recent decision by the Supreme Court on letting Petrobras going ahead with the sale of the 8 refineries that are already, some of them are already in the binding phase, I should say. It's a very good message. Petrobras does have political support, and that is very important for the company to be able to continue with its strategy. Now, regarding general investment strategy, it remains unchanged. It is already 2-3 years that Petrobras has very strongly, is refocusing all its investment on high value creation projects. And that basically in Brazil, that means pre-salt, and more pre-salt. I mean, Petrobras is very lucky to have come across a few years ago to a very high value new region, the pre-salt. And for example, it is 100% owner of the Búzios giant fields, which is set to increase from today's more or less 60K barrel oil per day to very soon in the future 2 million barrels per day. It's a huge province, a lot of very good quality oil, a lot of also of associated gas, and very reasonable lifting cost in the pre-salt. And so there are lots of opportunities, lots of factors that mean that our view for Petrobras short-term future and mid and long-term is relatively possible, even with a view of an environment which is lower for longer in oil prices and demand for oil products. And I think that's for now for my initial remarks. I hope I kept the 8 minutes, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Sylvie. I'm having trouble with my video here for the moment, but I want to go back to Jeremy because we're running out of time here. We have to end at 10 on the dot because we've got Minister Diego Mesa coming up. But I want to make sure that we talk about Bolivia because the elections are so soon. So Jeremy, just I guess briefly, what do you think the most probable outcomes are of the election later this month, and what would the implications be for the role of YPFB in the natural gas sector? Would Luis Arce, the MAS candidate, bring back a larger role for YPFB, or how do you see things playing out?
Yeah, no, thanks, Nate. I think, remains to be seen. It looks like, Arce's got a significant lead in polling. The question is whether he wins outright in the first round or if it goes to a second round. As we learned last year, Bolivia has a pretty specific trigger for second round. So we'll see if Arce is able to win outright in the first round or if it goes to a second round, which, as we know, second rounds are always interesting, how different support coalesces. So I wouldn't rule out Mesa in the second round somehow pulling it off. But I think the point to the question here is that YPFB will continue to be a state of enterprise. There will not be, I don't think, regardless of who wins, Mesa or Arce, a dramatic shift back to sort of what we could consider liberalization of that, of throwing open YPFB again to to a whole bunch of private capital. Now, with that said, I think there will be distinguishing factors between both parties in how they continue to manage YPFB. You'll probably see some of the former leadership come back into government under Arce with YPFB. But I think it's also important to note this word pragmatism that I cited in my opening comments. And I think you will absolutely see that within Arce government. I've seen signals, I've heard from people, and I've heard directly from the head of YPFB under Morales, actually, that there is an effort, there will be an effort to act as a company, not just a state of enterprise outside of Bolivia, and specifically I'm referencing Brazil. And so if we think about everything Sylvie talked about in terms of the competitive natural gas market, one of the things the former head of YPFB in Bolivia said is YPFB, want to position themselves as a competitor and market participant in that newly liberalized or increasingly liberalized Brazilian gas market. So I think it'll be interesting to see. The final point I would make is I absolutely believe that an Arce government will be distinct from a Morales government. I think you'll see also a much different posture vis-a-vis the United States. I think there will absolutely be a desire to bring more foreign and private investment. I think there won't be such, polarization between the two countries. And that's largely because of the need for investment and the need for foreign direct investment. And I think if we extrapolate that perhaps to the lithium opportunity there as well, you might see some difference on just exactly the role of the state in the development model there, regardless of an Arce or Mesa government.
Thank you, Jeremy. I had a question for Alejandra too about the Pemex's monopoly, specifically in fuels. So the government has made some changes to fuel markets, like improving price transparency and third-party access to pipelines. And I wanted to ask you where these policies stand and how they're affected the position of private companies vis-a-vis Pemex in downstream markets.
Well, certainly, as I mentioned, what is changing in this administration is really how they are implementing the reforms. So the regulators and the people in charge of overlook the market evolution are kind of working in a very slow path, and part is because of the pandemic, and part is because the austerity measures on this administration is cutting employees and cutting a lot of the capabilities of these institutions to continue implementing the reform and to continue overlooking the markets that are in this incipient competitive path, right? So certainly that is complicated, and it's not necessary to change the laws and things like that, but it's how the market is evolving is really moving very slow, even though I think private sector has a very good appetite about specifically the downstream and importing fuels, participating in retail, bringing new completely new logistics to bring products from US in a very efficient way. So if you add that the US Gulf Coast refineries are the most competitive in the world right now, and that you can bring it into a more efficient logistics to the Mexican market, the competition is evolving. So even though Pemex is not giving third parties access to the pipelines, or even though Pemex is trying to supply the market with this unfair price at terminals or things like that, I think that the market is evolving. It's slow, it's not evolving as fast as we would like to see, but the new players are bringing really a very competitive fuels into the market and a completely different strategy. We cannot stop that at this moment. And it's still moving on. The issue about if the regulators stop providing the permits for importing fuels, for example, or stop providing new fuels for terminals building or things like that. Well, certainly and unfortunately, there are a lot of suits and the tribunals are getting into play and they are solving, and there is a lot of discussions that what I can see is that it's just slowing down the possibility to see a more competitive market sooner, but it's not completely stopping that. That's my comment.
Thank you. I saw one last question that we can kick over to Sylvie for just, you know, a very brief response about elections aren't imminent in Brazil, but there was a question about what a return of the Workers' Party to power would mean for Petrobras. So if you could answer that in about a minute, Sylvie.
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. But what I can say is that even under PT rule in the past, contract sanctity has always been respected. So what I would say is what is done is done. So if Petrobras manages to sell its refineries during the next 2 years, if the government moves ahead with the approving the law and all the decrees and secondary legislation, it will be difficult for a new PT government to actually undo everything. So I think it's important to watch what will be done in the next few years before the next election.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much to all of you. As usual, we don't have enough time to cover everything. But I want to thank all of you again, and thank everyone in the audience for watching and submitting questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I am going to pass it back to Lisa because we've got a keynote session on deck with Minister Diego Mesa of Colombia.